My parents looked me straight in the eye at my own graduation dinner and told me I would never measure up to my sister. They forced me to empty my savings to pay for a celebration that was not even about me. So I threw $5,000 in cash on the table, walked out the door, and completely vanished from their lives for 5 years. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea that the daughter they constantly humiliated was quietly building an empire that would soon hold their entire fake upper-class existence in the palm of her hand. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how this revenge unfolds. It was supposed to be my night. I had just walked across the stage to receive my Master of Business Administration. I spent 3 grueling years working double shifts to pay my tuition while studying late into the night. My parents, Pastor Calvin and First Lady Brenda, insisted on hosting a celebratory dinner at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Atlanta. I actually thought that for once in my 30 years of life, they were proud of me. I was completely wrong. The moment I sat down at the lavish table, I realized the dinner was not a celebration of my hard work. It was a stage for my older sister Dominique and her husband Preston. Preston came from what he constantly called old money in Charleston. He was white loud and carried an arrogance that my parents absolutely worshipped. They treated him like a king simply because his last name was attached to a historical trust fund. My mother tapped her crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon to get everyone to look at her. I smiled, thinking she was going to propose a toast to my degree. Instead, she beamed at Dominique and Preston. "Thank you all for gathering tonight," she announced, her voice carrying that perfect Sunday service pitch. "We are here to celebrate the real stars of the family. Dominique is officially moving into her new $3 million estate in Buckhead, and she is carrying the first son of Preston. God is truly blessing our family with elite status." My heart sank. My degree was not mentioned once. The diploma sitting in my bag suddenly felt completely worthless. The entire evening devolved into the Preston and Dominique show. My father leaned across the table, hanging on to every word Preston said about his supposed real estate investments. When I tried to bring up my new business plan, Preston actually laughed out loud. "A business degree is cute, Camille," he said with a condescending smirk. "But you do not learn real wealth in a classroom. You are born into it or you marry into it. You should probably look for a solid entry-level corporate job. Maybe one day you can be an assistant for one of my fund managers." Dominique patted his arm adoringly. "Do not be mean, babe," she teased. "Camille tries her best. It is not her fault she lacks the polished aesthetic our circle requires. She is just going to have to work a little harder to fit in anywhere." My parents nodded in agreement. I sat there in silence, gripping my linen napkin under the table. This was the dynamic of my entire life. I was the dark-skinned, curly-haired disappointment who asked too many questions. Dominique was the golden child who played the perfect role. Then the waiter arrived with the leather checkbook. The damage was $4,500. They had ordered imported caviar vintage champagne and the most expensive Wagyu steaks on the menu. Preston confidently reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy metal credit card. "Allow me," he declared loudly, making sure the tables nearby could hear him. A man always takes care of his family. The waiter took the card with a polite bow and walked away. 5 minutes later he returned. His face was pale and his voice was hushed. "Sir, I am so sorry, but this card has been declined. Do you have another form of payment?" The table went dead silent. Preston turned bright red and stammered something about a bank error and frozen assets. Dominique looked humiliated. My father panicked. He could not stand the idea of causing a scene at a high-society restaurant. He turned his desperate, angry eyes directly toward me. "Camille, give him your card," my father ordered. I stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me," I asked. "You heard me?" my father hissed, leaning closer. "Preston is having a banking issue. You have been saving money from those little side jobs you work. Pay the bill before you embarrass us all." I am not paying $4,500 for a dinner that was supposed to be for my graduation, I replied, my voice steady but shaking with quiet rage. You did not even mention my name once tonight. My mother slammed her hand on the table. How dare you be so selfish, she whispered fiercely. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. Your sister is pregnant. Preston is a prominent businessman going through a temporary freeze. You will never measure up to your sister if you cannot even show basic family loyalty. Pay the bill, or you are no longer welcome in our home. They looked at me, expecting me to fold. They expected the obedient scapegoat to hand over her life savings just to keep the peace. But something inside me finally snapped. The desperate need for their approval simply evaporated. I slowly reached into my designer purse, which I had bought with my own hard-earned money. I pulled out a thick envelope of cash I had withdrawn earlier that day to deposit into my new business account. I counted out exactly $5,000 in crisp $100 bills and dropped them onto the center of the table. Here is the money, I said, standing up and looking down at the 4 people who were supposed to be my family. Consider this my final payment for the roof you put over my head. Enjoy the meal. Do not ever contact me again. I turned around and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. As I stepped into the cool night air, I pulled out my phone and blocked every single one of their numbers. I did not shed a single tear. I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. I was officially free, and I was ready to build my empire. 5 years is a long time when you are building an empire. I poured every ounce of my energy into real estate acquisition. I turned that $5,000 into a massive portfolio of luxury properties across the Southeast. I was now the founder and chief executive officer of the Onyx Resort, a $50 million sanctuary for the ultra-wealthy, nestled in the lush outskirts of Atlanta. I completely erased my toxic family from my life. I changed my phone number, my address, and my social media presence. I was a ghost to them, but a titan in the business world. My life was finally peaceful until my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number on a quiet Tuesday morning. The message was brief and dripping with the familiar arrogance I had not missed. Mom and Dad said you were working around here, so we are coming to see you. Open the gate, and do not make me wait. It was Dominique. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave of memories wash over me. I had no idea how they found out my general location, but they clearly had no idea who I actually was or what I owned. They probably tracked down some outdated employment record from when I first bought the land under a shell company. I could have easily told my security team to turn them away at the front gates. But a small part of me, the part that still remembered the humiliation of that steakhouse dinner, wanted to see what they wanted. I texted back the main gate code and told my staff to let them through. I walked down the grand sweeping staircase of the main lobby. The Onyx was an architectural masterpiece, featuring towering glass walls, imported marble floors, and a breathtaking view of the private lake. I was dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored charcoal suit. I did not wear flashy jewelry or designer logos because when you actually own the building, you do not need to prove your wealth to anyone. As I reached the ground floor, I saw them walking through the massive bronze double doors. Dominique and Preston looked exactly the same, just a little older, and somehow even more pretentious. Dominique was wearing a loud designer dress that screamed for attention, while Preston wore a pastel polo shirt, paired with a sweater draped lazily over his shoulders. They stopped in the middle of the lobby, looking around with wide eyes. For a brief second I saw genuine awe on their faces as they took in the sheer opulence of the resort. But that awe instantly vanished the moment Dominique locked eyes with me. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain charcoal suit, and her lips curled into a familiar cruel smirk. "Well, look who we finally tracked down," Dominique said loudly, making sure the passing guests could hear her. "Mom and Dad thought you were dead or in jail, but I told them you were probably just cleaning toilets for rich people. I guess I was right. Look at you playing dress-up in a little uniform. Are you the front desk manager, or just a glorified concierge?" I stood my ground and kept my face completely neutral. I did not correct her. The reality of my success was far too massive for her narrow mind to comprehend anyway. I just looked at her and asked what she was doing here after 5 years of absolute silence. Preston stepped forward with that same insufferable arrogance he had at my graduation dinner. "Do not use that tone with us, Camille," he warned, adjusting his expensive watch. "You should be thanking us for even taking the time to come all the way out here to the suburbs. We heard through the grapevine that you got a job at this place. It is actually a decent property. Whoever owns it clearly has old money taste. It is a shame they hire such unpolished staff, though. I might have to speak to your boss about your attitude." I almost smiled. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He was standing in my lobby threatening to report me to myself. I simply folded my hands behind my back and asked them again what they wanted. I knew they did not drive all the way out here just to insult my outfit. They always wanted something. Dominique sighed dramatically and crossed her arms. "Listen, we do not have time to catch up on your sad little life. Preston is hosting a massive charity gala this weekend for his investment fund. It is going to be packed with high-net-worth individuals and local politicians. Our original venue fell through because of a scheduling error. We need a place that matches our elite status, and this resort will do. We need you to pull whatever strings you have as a manager and get us the grand ballroom for Saturday night." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us. She was demanding the most expensive venue in the city on 4 days' notice, expecting me to risk my supposed job to accommodate her, and she was doing it while actively insulting me. "And what makes you think I have the authority to just hand over the grand ballroom?" I asked calmly. "It costs $50,000 a night just to rent the space." Preston scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Oh, please," he muttered. "You are the concierge, are you not? You have the keys. Just let us in through the back and we will take care of the rest. I will even slide you a few $100 for your trouble. Since you are struggling to make rent on your tiny apartment, consider it charity from your very successful family members." I looked into his desperate, lying eyes and realized they were handing me the perfect weapon to destroy them. I stood behind the polished marble of the front desk and looked at my sister and her husband. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the reality of the situation. Preston was sweating slightly under his expensive sweater. It was a subtle detail, but it told me everything I needed to know. Men with real money do not sweat when they demand a room. Men who are drowning in debt sweat. I decided to play along and let them believe they were still in control of my completely insignificant life as a lowly employee. My executive assistant Elena was standing discreetly near the back office door. She had been with me since the beginning and knew exactly how to handle uninvited guests. Without making a sound, she walked over and slid a sleek black tablet across the counter so only I could see the screen. We had a strict protocol at the Onyx Resort. Anyone attempting to book the grand ballroom had to pass an instant financial background check. Elena had run Preston and his so-called investment fund through our private security database the moment they started making their loud and ridiculous demands. I casually glanced down at the glowing screen while Dominique continued to complain about the floral arrangements in the lobby. The financial dossier on the tablet was absolutely devastating. Preston was not just struggling. His entire investment fund was completely bankrupt. The screen showed multiple pending lawsuits from angry investors, several federal tax liens, and zero liquid assets. He was drowning in millions of dollars of debt. His credit score was practically non-existent. I scrolled down slightly and saw that his company accounts had been frozen for weeks. He was legally prohibited from making any new financial trades or deals. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. This charity gala was not a legitimate networking event for a successful business. It was a desperate and highly illegal scam. Preston was planning to bring high-net-worth individuals into my luxury resort to dazzle them with an illusion of wealth. He wanted to use the pristine reputation of the Onyx to trick them into giving him money so he could pay off his massive debts. He was planning to commit wire fraud and securities fraud on a massive scale right under my roof, using my own property as the bait. If I simply threw them out right now, they would just go find some other venue to run their scam. My parents would continue to worship Preston as a financial genius, and Dominique would go on living her fake elite lifestyle while tearing me down to anyone who would listen. They would never face any real consequences for their actions. But if I gave them exactly what they wanted, I could expose them on the biggest stage possible. I could let them build their house of cards as high as they wanted before I personally knocked it all straight down. I looked up from the tablet and met my sister's impatient gaze. Well, are you going to help us? Or do I need to find the actual general manager? Dominique snapped, tapping her manicured fingernails against the marble counter. You have been staring at that screen for 5 minutes. Do not tell me you forgot how to use the booking software, Camille. We do not have all day to wait for you to figure out your basic job duties. We have very important guests arriving this weekend, and we need to guarantee that the space is absolutely flawless today itself. I gave her a small apologetic smile, perfectly playing the role of the intimidated younger sister. I am sorry, Dominique, I said softly. It is just that the grand ballroom is highly restricted. If my boss finds out I let someone use it without a massive deposit, I could lose my job. Preston let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He leaned across the desk and looked at me with pure pity. Your boss is not going to care when he sees the caliber of people I am bringing to his resort, he said with total and complete unshakable blind confidence. Just give us the keys, and I will personally make sure your boss knows you were helpful, Preston promised. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled crisp $100 bill, and tossed it onto the counter like he was feeding a stray dog. Buy yourself something nice to wear, Camille. That suit is looking a little tired. I stared at the crumpled bill. A man who was millions of dollars in debt was giving me $100 out of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. It took every single ounce of my self-control not to laugh out loud. I slowly reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy velvet box containing the master VIP keys. These electronic key cards granted unrestricted access to the grand ballroom, the private catering kitchens, and the luxury guest suites on the top floor. I placed the box on the counter and slid it toward them. You can have the ballroom for Saturday night, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I will bypass the billing system for now. Just make sure you do not cause any permanent damage to the property. My boss is very particular about the expensive hardwood floors. Dominique snatched the velvet box off the counter with a triumphant smirk. See, Preston? I told you she would be useful for once in her life, Dominique said, turning to her husband. It is a good thing we tracked her down. Try not to mess this up, Camille. We will be back on Friday with our event planners. Do not make eye contact with our guests and stay out of our way. They turned and walked toward the exit, completely unaware that I had just handed them the exact weapon they would use to entirely destroy their own miserable lives. The very next afternoon, a glossy black luxury vehicle pulled up to the grand entrance of the Onyx. It was clearly a rental, but the two people who stepped out of the back seat acted as if they owned the entire fleet. Pastor Calvin and First Lady Brenda had arrived. They were dressed in their absolute Sunday best on a random Thursday afternoon. My mother wore a matching lavender skirt suit with a wide-brimmed hat, while my father wore a custom-tailored suit. They expected everyone to stop and stare at their undeniable glory. I watched from the second-floor mezzanine as my father snapped his fingers at the valet tossing his keys onto the pavement instead of handing them over properly. My mother followed closely behind him, complaining loudly about the humidity ruining her hair. They walked through the massive bronze doors with their chins held high, looking around the lobby, as if assessing a property they were about to purchase. Dominique had obviously called them the moment she left the resort yesterday, bragging about how she had put me in my place and secured the ballroom. Now my parents were here to claim their piece of the pie and enjoy the spoils of Preston's imaginary wealth. I slowly walked down the sweeping glass staircase, my footsteps silent against the imported marble. My mother spotted me immediately. Her eyes narrowed as she looked me up and down, taking in my charcoal suit and plain black heels. Well, look at you, Camille, she said, her voice echoing across the lobby. Dominique told me you were wearing a little uniform, but I did not expect it to look so dreary. You are working at a high-end resort now. You need to fix your face and smile more. Your service attitude has always been terrible. My father stepped forward and offered me a stiff nod. He did not hug me or ask how I had been for the last 5 years. He simply looked at me like I was a disappointing employee who was lucky to be in his presence. It is good to see you have found a stable job, Camille, my father said, adjusting his tie. Preston was incredibly generous to bring his elite charity gala to this venue. It is going to bring your boss a lot of good publicity. You should make sure you thank Preston the next time you see him. If you play your cards right, he might even put a good word in for you. I kept my expression entirely blank. The absolute audacity of these people was truly a marvel to witness. They were standing inside a $50 million resort that I owned from the ground up, and they were lecturing me about thanking a broke fraudster for his charity. I nodded slowly, playing along with their ridiculous fantasy. I appreciate the advice, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Is there something specific I can help you with today? Or are you just here to inspect my uniform? My mother let out a sharp sigh and placed her handbag on the desk. Actually, we have a problem with the accommodations, she announced. Dominique booked us a luxury suite for the weekend, but I have very sensitive allergies. The air circulation on the lower floors is simply unacceptable for someone in my position. I need to be on the highest floor possible. I stared at her. The top floor of the Onyx Resort consisted entirely of my private residential penthouse. It was a sprawling 4,000 square foot sanctuary with a private infinity pool and panoramic views of the lake. It was not available for guests. It was my home. I am afraid the top floor is not available for regular booking, I told her softly. Those are restricted quarters. My mother scoffed and rolled her eyes. Do not be so difficult, Camille, she snapped. Dominique told me you live on the property. She said you have staff quarters up there. I know how these resorts work. The managers always get the best views while the paying guests suffer. I am the mother of the woman who is bringing this resort its biggest event of the year. You are going to pack your little bags right now and vacate your staff quarters so your father and I can have a proper place to sleep. My father crossed his arms and looked at me sternly. Your mother is right, Camille, he said in his deep preaching voice. Honor thy father and thy mother. It is the least you can do after everything we have done for you. You can sleep on a cot in the basement or bunk with one of the maids for a few days. It will build your character. I looked back and forth between the two of them. They were demanding that I kick myself out of my own multi-million-dollar penthouse so they could sleep in my bed and pretend they were royalty. A normal person would have lost their temper and kicked them out, but I was a predator watching my prey walk blindly into a cage. If I gave them the penthouse, they would become even more intoxicated by their fake power. They would strut around the resort demanding things and making a scene which would only make their eventual downfall that much more humiliating in front of the entire congregation. I let a look of fake defeat wash over my face. I sighed heavily and looked down at the marble floor. Fine, I whispered, sounding completely broken. I will have my assistant pack my things and move them to the lower levels. You can have the top floor suite for the weekend. My mother smiled triumphantly, completely satisfied that she had crushed my spirit once again. That is a good girl, she said, patting my cheek. Maybe there is hope for you yet. Have the bellboy bring our luggage up immediately. I watched my parents step into the private glass elevator, completely intoxicated by their stolen luxury. Once the doors closed, I signaled my security head to deactivate the penthouse locks for the weekend. I headed toward my private executive office hidden behind the administrative wing. I needed to review the final legal documents my lawyer had prepared for Saturday night. But before I could reach the heavy oak doors, a hand slammed against the wall right in front of my face, blocking my path. It was Preston. He had been lurking there waiting to catch me alone. His face was flushed and he reeked of expensive scotch and cheap desperation. He leaned in uncomfortably close, looking down his nose at me with a sickening sense of entitlement. Listen to me very carefully, Camille, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Your parents might accept your little attitude, but I do not. I am bringing millions of dollars of business into this establishment, and I expect absolute perfection. I noticed the valet took too long to park my car earlier. You need to get your staff in line immediately. I kept my face blank and stepped back to create some distance between us. I will speak to the valet team, sir, I replied, keeping my tone flat and professional. Preston scoffed and ran a hand through his hair. You people always need to be micromanaged, he muttered, shaking his head. The racial microaggression hung heavy in the air. It was the same subtle racism he always used against me disguised as frustration. He loved throwing around phrases like "you people" to remind me that no matter how hard I worked, I would always be beneath him in his eyes. My parents had always ignored his casual bigotry because his old money status blinded them to his true character. But I was not my parents, and I was not blind. You get a tiny bit of authority in a place like this, and you suddenly forget your place. Preston continued, stepping closer. Let me remind you exactly who you are dealing with. I am personal friends with the heavy hitters in this industry. If you step out of line, or if anything goes wrong this weekend, I will make one phone call to your boss, and you will be out on the street holding a cardboard sign. Do you understand me? He was trying so hard to project power, but all I saw was a weak man drowning in his own lies. His tailored suit could not hide his panic. I simply nodded and told him I understood completely. He smirked, adjusted his collar, and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I felt pure disgust. I immediately walked into my office and instructed my security team to keep a very close eye on him. A few hours later, I was standing on the second-floor interior balcony overlooking the grand lobby. My assistant Elena stood beside me holding a secure tablet. She pointed down toward the lounge area near the indoor waterfall. Preston was standing there with an older white gentleman dressed in a sharp navy suit. Elena informed me that the man was Richard Sterling, a highly respected venture capitalist from New York. Richard was known for investing heavy capital into luxury real estate, and he had a pristine reputation in the financial world. I watched intently as Preston guided Richard around the lobby, gesturing grandly at the imported marble columns, the custom art installations, and the crystal chandeliers. Preston was talking loudly, making sure his voice carried over the ambient music. I signaled to the audio technician in the security room to boost the frequency on the lobby microphones so I could hear their exact conversation through my earpiece. What I heard made my blood run cold with absolute disbelief. As you can see, Richard, the architecture here is unparalleled, Preston boasted, sweeping his arm across the room. I have spent the last 2 years quietly negotiating this deal. The current owners are highly motivated to sell, and my fund is in the final stages of acquiring the entire $50 million property. Once the ink is dry this weekend, we will rebrand and expand the golf course. Your $10 million buy-in will give you a 20% equity stake in the most profitable resort in the Southeast. Richard looked impressed. He nodded slowly, admiring the soaring glass ceilings. It is a stunning property, Preston, Richard admitted, but I need to see the final financial disclosures before I transfer the funds on Saturday. Preston laughed, a loud booming sound that echoed through the lobby. Of course, Richard, he assured him, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. My team is finalizing the paperwork as we speak. You will have everything you need at the gala. I pulled the earpiece out of my ear and handed it back to Elena, taking a deep breath to steady my racing thoughts. Preston was not just hosting a fake charity event to save face with my parents. He was actively committing federal wire fraud and securities fraud right in front of my very eyes. He was using the sheer physical proof of my hard-earned success to validate his pathetic lies. My lawyer Elijah, who also happened to be my soon-to-be husband, was going to have an absolute field day with this irrefutable evidence. I told Elena to pull the security footage and the audio transcripts immediately. We were going to package everything into a neat little file and send it directly to our contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I stood there for a long moment, watching him shake hands with the venture capitalist. The audacity of his crime was impressive in its sheer stupidity. Preston thought he was using my resort to save his crumbling empire, but all he was doing was building his own prison cell, right in the middle of my lobby. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the private lake, as I sat in the surveillance control room sipping a glass of sparkling water. A massive wall of monitors displayed every inch of the Onyx Resort in crisp, high definition. My security director stood quietly behind me, monitoring the live feeds. That is when one particular screen caught my immediate attention. It was camera 42, located in the exclusive mezzanine lounge just outside the private dining suites. My mother Brenda was pacing back and forth alone in the dimly lit corridor. She was wearing her signature oversized designer tote bag and looking nervously over her shoulder. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching her every move. She stopped directly in front of a small framed oil painting that hung perfectly illuminated on the textured wall. It was an authentic original piece from the Harlem Renaissance era, worth easily over $80,000. I had purchased it myself at an auction in London specifically for that corridor because the warm colors perfectly complemented the ambient lighting. My mother reached out and traced the ornate gold frame with her manicured fingers. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. She was the first lady of a prominent church, and she constantly obsessed over decorating her private church office to impress the wealthy members of the congregation. She probably thought that a luxury resort with hundreds of rooms would never notice one missing piece of art. She checked the empty hallway one more time before making her move. With surprising speed for a woman her age, she reached up, unhooked the heavy painting from its brass mounting, and quickly shoved it deep into her oversized leather tote bag. She threw a silk scarf over the top to conceal the edge of the frame. She adjusted her posture, patted her hair, and began walking casually toward the main glass elevators, like she had not just committed grand larceny. I did not panic or shout. I simply pressed the button on my radio console and spoke directly to the two plainclothes security officers stationed on the ground floor. Intercept the woman in the lavender suit exiting the mezzanine elevator. I instructed, my voice completely flat. Do not touch her. Just block her path and wait for me. I stood up, smoothed the front of my charcoal blazer, and took the private staff elevator down to the main lobby. When the glass doors of her elevator slid open on the ground floor, my mother stepped out with a smug, satisfied look on her face. That look instantly vanished when two massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly in front of her, blocking her path to the front doors. "Excuse me?" she huffed, trying to sidestep them. "Do you know who I am? Move out of my way immediately." The guards did not blink or move a single muscle. I walked slowly across the marble floor until I was standing right beside them. My mother turned to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and sudden panic. "Camille, tell these giant thugs to get out of my way," she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "I am a VIP guest of Preston, and I am going out for an evening stroll." I looked down at the massive leather tote bag, practically bursting at the seams. "You can go on your stroll, Mother," I said calmly. "But the $80,000 Harlem Renaissance original painting, currently sitting under your silk scarf, needs to stay here." The color completely drained from her face. She instinctively clutched the bag tighter against her chest, looking around to see if anyone had heard me. "I do not know what you are talking about," she hissed, leaning in close. "How dare you accuse your own mother of stealing? You are just a bitter little girl making up lies to embarrass me." I raised my hand and motioned to the security camera mounted right above the elevator bank. "There are over 300 high-definition cameras on this property, Mother," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I literally just watched you take it off the wall on a 4K monitor. I have the entire sequence recorded from 3 different angles. If you do not hand it over right now, I am going to have these officers detain you until the local authorities arrive." She gasped, taking a step back, as if I had physically struck her. Her precious image was her entire world. The thought of the police arriving at a luxury resort to arrest the prominent First Lady Brenda for stealing art was a nightmare she could not even fathom. At that exact moment, my father, Pastor Calvin, walked out of the adjacent cigar lounge. He saw the security guards and hurried over, his face flushed with irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, looking from me to the guards. "Camille, why are you harassing your mother?" "She took a painting from the mezzanine lounge," I said bluntly. "I am giving her 5 seconds to return it before I call the police." My father froze. He looked at my mother, who was now sweating and trembling. "Brenda," he whispered, his voice cracking with shock. "Tell me she is lying." My mother squeezed her eyes shut, tears of pure humiliation threatening to spill over. She slowly opened her tote bag, pulled out the framed oil painting, and shoved it roughly into the hands of the nearest security guard. "It was just sitting there gathering dust," she muttered defensively, refusing to make eye contact with me. "I was simply going to borrow it to show the church board. A place this big has so much money they do not need it anyway." "You are a terrible daughter for treating me like a common criminal, Camille." I leaned in close so only my parents could hear me. "I am going to make this very clear to both of you," I whispered. "If you ever try to steal from this property again, I will not just call the police. I will take the security footage and personally send it to every single news station in Atlanta. I will make sure they play the video of the famous First Lady stuffing stolen art into her purse on the 5 o'clock broadcast every night for a week. Your congregation will see exactly who you really are." My parents stared at me in absolute stunned silence. The sheer authority in my voice completely shattered their illusion that I was just a weak little girl they could bully. They were genuinely terrified of me in that moment. My father grabbed my mother's arm and practically dragged her toward the elevators to go back to their room. They still completely believed that I was just a ruthless manager protecting my wealthy boss. But they finally realized that I held the power to destroy their reputation with the snap of my fingers. I watched them retreat, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth spread through my chest. The trap was set, Preston was digging his own grave, and my parents were finally learning what it felt like to be completely powerless. The next morning, I had temporarily relocated my belongings to an executive suite on the second floor. It was not my penthouse, but it was still incredibly luxurious. I left my door unlocked because my assistant Elena was dropping off files. I was only gone for 10 minutes, but when I walked back into my suite, I did not find Elena. Instead, I found my sister Dominique standing in the middle of my bedroom, wearing a white silk robe from the resort spa, staring at herself in my mirror. But that was not what made my blood boil. Resting perfectly against her collarbone was a custom-designed diamond and sapphire necklace. It was a Cartier piece worth exactly $1.5 million. My fiancé Elijah had bought it for me at a private auction in Geneva as a wedding gift, featuring a massive blue sapphire surrounded by incredibly rare diamonds. I kept it stored in a locked velvet case inside my safe, but I had taken it out earlier that morning to pair with my gala dress. Dominique must have slipped into my room, seen the open box on the vanity, and decided to help herself. She was completely mesmerized by the blinding sparkle of the stones, admiring how the blue sapphire caught the natural light. "What are you doing in my room?" I asked, crossing my arms. Dominique jumped, slightly startled by my voice, but she quickly recovered her signature arrogant smirk. "Oh, please, just relax, Camille," she sighed with an annoyed tone. "Your assistant told me you were in here, so I came to complain about the room service menu. But then I saw this beauty sitting on the counter." She tapped the center sapphire with a manicured nail. "I have to admit, your boss has decent taste in employee loaner pieces. I am wearing this to the gala tomorrow night. It perfectly matches the aesthetic Preston and I want." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. My sister truly believed that a multi-million-dollar piece of fine jewelry was just a prop that a hotel manager could borrow for the weekend. "Take it off then, Dominique," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That does not belong to the resort, and it certainly does not belong to you. It is a private piece, and you are going to take it off your neck and put it back in the velvet box right now before I call security." Dominique rolled her eyes and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Please, Camille, you are just a glorified maid," she sneered, taking a step back. "You do not own anything like this. I am the guest of honor this weekend, and I am carrying Preston's child. I deserve to wear something that reflects my elite status. I took a step forward, ready to physically remove the priceless necklace from her neck myself if I absolutely had to. But before I could reach her, my father, Pastor Calvin, walked into the suite, with my mother trailing closely behind him. "What is all this yelling about?" my father demanded, looking back and forth between the two of us. "Daddy, tell Camille to stop being so terribly selfish," Dominique whined instantly, switching into her pathetic little girl victim voice. "I found this resort necklace sitting out, and I want to wear it for Preston's big night. But Camille is throwing a massive tantrum and trying to hoard it for herself, just to ruin my evening." My father looked at the spectacular diamonds glittering on Dominique's neck. His eyes widened with obvious greed, but he quickly masked it with a stern, pastoral expression. He turned to me with a look of deep, profound disappointment. "Camille?" He began, his voice echoing with that familiar, manipulative preaching tone he used every Sunday. "Your sister is bringing a precious child into this world. She is the devoted wife of a highly successful investor who is blessing your workplace with his esteemed presence. If you have access to flashy jewelry like this as a property manager, you should gladly offer it to your sister to elevate the family image in front of the wealthy guests." I shook my head, unable to comprehend their relentless audacity. "I am not offering her anything," I replied firmly, holding my ground. "That necklace is not a resort perk. It is extremely valuable, and it stays in this room with me." "How incredibly greedy can you be?" my mother yelled shrilly. "After everything we sacrificed for you." My father raised his hand to silence her. "Let me make this very clear, Camille," my father warned, stepping closer. "You will permanently gift that necklace to your sister right now. Consider it a long overdue apology for your terrible behavior at your graduation dinner. If you refuse, I will call a special meeting with the church elders on Sunday. I will have you formally excommunicated and completely disowned. You will be dead to us forever." My father was threatening to excommunicate me over a piece of jewelry he thought was a cheap employee perk, not realizing he was demanding a $1.5 million asset. I could have laughed. I could have called my security team to have all of them arrested for grand larceny immediately, but the gala was tomorrow. My trap was already set and everything was perfectly in motion. I needed them to feel completely invincible until the exact moment they stepped onto that stage. I forced my eyes to the floor, pretending to look entirely defeated. I swallowed hard, acting as though his vicious threat had completely broken my spirit. "Fine," I whispered in the quiet room, my voice sounding completely broken. "You can wear it." Dominique smirked triumphantly, brushing past me and deliberately bumping my shoulder as she walked out. "Do not be so dramatic, Camille," she sneered over her shoulder. "It looks so much better on me anyway than it ever could on you." The afternoon of the gala approached, and the Onyx Resort was buzzing with frantic energy. Catering staff rushed through the lower levels, pushing heavy carts loaded with expensive crystal and gleaming silver platters. Florists were arranging thousands of white roses and rare orchids in the grand ballroom to create an illusion of absolute perfection. I walked through the private service corridors on the ground floor, holding a digital tablet to review the final security protocols for the evening. The air was thick with the rich smell of roasting meats and fresh flowers. I needed a brief moment of quiet before the storm finally broke, so I took a detour through the restricted administrative hallway that connected the main kitchens to the private executive offices. The long corridor was completely empty and dimly lit with warm, recessed lighting. My footsteps were entirely silent against the thick, custom-woven carpet. Suddenly, a heavy hand violently slammed against the wall just inches from my face. I stopped dead in my tracks. Preston stepped out from the deep recessed doorway of an empty conference room, blocking my path completely. He looked entirely different from the arrogant man who had strutted into my lobby just 2 days ago. His expensive designer tie was loosened, and his collar was unbuttoned, revealing a red rash on his neck. His eyes were bloodshot and darting frantically around the empty hallway. He smelled heavily, like a mix of expensive scotch and cheap, overwhelming desperation. He was breathing rapidly, as if he had been pacing in that dark room for hours, waiting specifically for me to walk by. He did not say a single word at first. He just reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents folded in half. He forcefully threw the papers directly at my chest. They hit me hard and scattered onto the pristine floor, but I did not flinch or reach down to pick them up. I just stared coldly into his panicked, chaotic eyes. "Pick them up, Camille," he ordered, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of blind rage and sheer panic. "You are going to sign those right now." I slowly looked down at the documents resting by my leather shoes. The bold black header on the first page clearly read Corporate Bridge Loan Guarantee. I looked back up at him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral and unbothered. "What exactly am I looking at, Preston?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. He ran a shaking, sweaty hand through his perfectly styled hair and took a step closer to me. "It is just a temporary bridge loan," he explained, speaking far too quickly and stumbling over his words. "Richard and the other heavy hitters are transferring $10 million to my fund tomorrow morning, but there is some bureaucratic red tape holding up my offshore accounts. My bank needs a guarantor to float $2 million just for 24 hours to clear the massive holding fees. I need you to sign that document right now as the executive property manager of the Onyx Resort. You are going to use the corporate credentials of this property to back my loan." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He was not just a desperate fraudster, he was completely delusional. He actually believed that a random hotel employee could legally bind a $50 million luxury property to a $2 million personal loan without the real owner's consent. He was drowning in so much debt that his brain had completely detached from reality. He thought he could bully me into committing massive federal corporate fraud just to save his own sinking ship. And why on earth would I do that? I asked him, stepping back and folding my arms tightly across my chest. Why would I risk my prestigious job and my personal freedom to guarantee a massive loan for a man who has treated me like absolute garbage since the very day I met him? Preston's face twisted into an ugly, terrifying snarl. "Because you owe us," he spat, taking another aggressive step forward until he was practically towering over my personal space. "Your parents took you in and gave you a privileged life. Dominique is your sister and she is carrying my child. If my fund collapses this weekend, she loses absolutely everything. She loses the expensive house, the luxury cars, and the elite lifestyle. The stress could ruin her pregnancy. You are going to sign that paper because if you do not, I will march right into the lobby and tell your parents that you purposely sabotaged my business just because you are a jealous, bitter little failure. They will officially disown you, Camille. They will completely erase you from the family history forever." He was using the exact same emotional threats my father had used hours earlier. They honestly believed that the deep fear of losing their toxic conditional love was enough to make me surrender my entire life. I slowly reached down and picked up the thick stack of papers. I flipped through the pages, pretending to read the ridiculous legal jargon. Preston's tense shoulders visibly relaxed. He actually thought he had won. He thought he had successfully intimidated the weak little sister into saving his pathetic existence. I closed the heavy folder and looked him dead in the eye. I gripped the top of the thick document with both of my hands. Then, with a slow and incredibly deliberate motion, I tore the entire stack of papers perfectly in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet, empty hallway. Preston's jaw dropped in absolute pure shock. I placed the two halves together and tore them again, ripping the legally binding contract into quarters. I opened my hands and let the shredded pieces of his last desperate hope flutter to the carpet like dirty snow. "You are out of your mind, Preston," I whispered coldly, stepping right into his personal space until he was forced to look down at me. "I do not care about your collapsing fraudulent fund. I do not care about your fake old money status. And I certainly do not care if my parents disown me because I permanently disowned them 5 years ago. You are going to fail tonight, and you are going to do it all on your own." Preston's face turned a deep, violent shade of purple. The carefully crafted illusion of the sophisticated wealthy gentleman completely shattered, leaving only a violent cornered animal. "You arrogant little brat," he screamed, raising his right hand high into the air. His hand formed a tight, white-knuckled fist, and he swung it down, aiming directly for my face with all of his remaining strength. I did not even blink. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not have to. Before Preston's fist could travel even 6 inches, a massive blur of motion erupted from the dark shadows behind him. The two plainclothes security officers, who had been silently tailing me all afternoon, lunged forward with terrifying lightning speed. The first officer grabbed Preston's raised arm and twisted it violently behind his back. I heard a sharp, painful pop that made Preston scream out in absolute agony. The second officer grabbed him by the back of the neck and slammed him face first into the textured wall. The heavy impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. Preston gasped and choked helplessly, pinned against the wall by two massive men. His expensive watch scraped loudly against the wallpaper. He looked at me through terrified, tear-filled eyes, his cheek pressed incredibly hard against the plaster. I casually brushed an invisible piece of dust off my tailored blazer. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but sheer pity for the pathetic broken man bleeding on my wall. "Do not ever raise your hand to me again, Preston," I said, my voice echoing like solid ice in the quiet corridor. "Save your energy. You are going to need it to face your wealthy investors tonight." I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him pinned securely to the wall, waiting for his final inevitable destruction to arrive. As I walked away, I could hear Preston struggling against the security guards. He was gasping for air and shouting desperate threats to my back. "You are going to regret this, Camille." He choked out, his voice raw and filled with toxic venom. "I am going to make sure your boss knows exactly what you did to me. I will destroy your pathetic little career in front of everyone at the gala tonight. You will be unemployed and homeless by tomorrow morning." I did not even bother to turn around or acknowledge his empty threats. I simply raised my hand without looking back and signaled the security officers to release him and escort him back to his suite. He was no longer a real threat. He was just a desperate clown performing his final pathetic act before the curtains closed permanently. I took the private glass elevator up to the real executive suite on the 3rd floor. This was not the small administrative room my family thought I worked in. This was the true heart of the Onyx Resort, a sprawling, gorgeous office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private lake, massive mahogany bookshelves, and a sleek, modern glass desk. Sitting behind that desk, waiting for me, was Elijah, my fiancé and the most brilliant corporate attorney in the entire state of Georgia. Elijah looked up from his laptop and smiled, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and holding a thick manila folder in his hands. "You look like a woman who just successfully cornered a very desperate rat," he said, leaning back in the plush leather executive chair. I walked over and poured myself a glass of iced lemon water from the crystal pitcher on the sideboard. "The rat tried to bite," I replied, taking a long, slow sip to cool my adrenaline. "He tried to force me to sign a $2 million corporate bridge loan to save his sinking fund. He even tried to physically hit me when I ripped the fraudulent contract to shreds." Elijah's warm smile vanished instantly, and his jaw tightened with sudden, fierce anger. He stood up, pushing the chair back, ready to go down there and handle Preston himself. I placed a hand flat on his chest and gently pushed him back. "Do not ruin the plan, Elijah," I told him softly but firmly. "My security team handled it perfectly, and Preston is currently nursing a bruised ego and a very sore face. We need him fully functional for tonight. If he gets scared and runs away now, we cannot expose him in front of his wealthy victims and my incredibly arrogant family." Elijah let out a long, heavy breath and nodded slowly, his sharp professional demeanor returning to his features. "You are right, my love," he said, tapping the heavy manila folder on the desk. "Let him dig the hole a little deeper before we bury him." Speaking of which, I just got off the phone with Special Agent Harris at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Wire Fraud Division has been building a case against Preston for 6 months, but they did not have the concrete evidence of him actively soliciting funds under false pretenses. The security footage and the audio transcripts you sent over this morning from the lobby were exactly what they needed to close the net. They have a federal warrant for his immediate arrest, and they are waiting in unmarked vehicles for my signal to enter the resort tonight. I smiled, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction wash over my entire body. The federal government was about to do the heavy lifting for me. And what about the foreclosure notices? I asked, looking at the documents spread across the glass desk. Elijah handed me a stack of legally certified papers with bright red stamps. The bank officially foreclosed on his luxury estate in Buckhead this morning. The massive iron gates are padlocked, and the eviction notices are currently taped to the front door. Dominique does not have a $3 million house to go back to after the gala tonight. They are completely and utterly bankrupt in every sense of the word. I ran my fingers over the raised notary seal on the foreclosure documents. My sister had spent my entire life looking down on me because I did not fit into her perfectly curated fake aesthetic. She had stolen my peace, insulted my career, and paraded her fraudulent husband around as if he were a literal god among men. My parents had blindly supported her cruel behavior, always eager to sacrifice my happiness and boundaries to protect their fake high society image. They had demanded that I give up my home, my expensive jewelry, and my basic human dignity just to make them comfortable in their lies. Tonight they were going to lose absolutely everything in front of the exact people they spent their entire lives trying desperately to impress. The countdown to 0 hour had officially begun, and there was no stopping the avalanche. "We have exactly 4 hours until the grand ballroom doors open," Elijah said, checking his silver wristwatch. "The catering team is ready. The lighting is set, and the exclusive guest list is completely verified. Richard Sterling and the other major investors have already arrived and are currently mingling in the lower champagne lounge. Preston truly thinks he is going to walk onto that stage and secure $10 million. He has absolutely no idea that he is walking directly into a federal trap." I walked over to the private dressing room attached to my office. Hanging inside was the gown I had chosen specifically for this incredible night. It was a breathtaking custom, haute couture piece made of deep emerald silk, the exact color my mother had forbidden me to wear as a child because she said it made my dark skin look too severe and unapproachable. It was elegant, powerful, and completely unapologetic. I was not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I was not going to wear a plain charcoal suit and pretend to be a lowly, subservient employee. Tonight, I was going to step directly into the blinding spotlight and claim my rightful place as the founder and chief executive officer of the Onyx Empire. Elijah walked up behind me and wrapped his strong arms around my waist, resting his chin softly on my shoulder. "Are you absolutely ready for this?" he asked softly, his voice filled with unwavering love and support. "It is going to be incredibly messy, and your family is going to hate you forever after tonight." I leaned back against his warm chest and let out a quiet, genuine laugh. "They already hate me, Elijah," I whispered, staring at our reflection in the full-length mirror. "They have hated me since the day they realized they could not control or break me. The only difference is that tomorrow morning they will not have the stolen money or the fake social status to hide their ugly truth from the world anymore." I turned around and looked up into his deep brown eyes. "I am more than ready," I told him with absolute certainty. Let the gala begin. The grand ballroom of the Onyx Resort was a masterpiece of modern luxury, and tonight it looked absolutely breathtaking. I walked out of my executive office and made my way down the private glass corridor that connected to the interior mezzanine. The mezzanine featured a sweeping curved balcony that hovered directly over the main floor of the ballroom, giving me the perfect unobstructed view of the entire event without being noticed by the crowd below. I stood in the shadows, leaning slightly against the polished marble railing, my emerald silk gown draped perfectly around me, making me feel like royalty. The soft ambient lighting caught the subtle shimmer of the fabric, but kept my face concealed in the dim upper levels down below. The heavy mahogany doors had just been thrown open to welcome the guests. The string quartet positioned in the corner began playing a flawless modern symphony. Preston had somehow managed to gather the absolute highest tier of the Atlanta Black elite and a very wealthy selection of traditional white investors. I watched as prominent city council members, highly successful tech entrepreneurs, and legendary real estate developers strolled onto the pristine hardwood floor. Women in dripping diamonds and men in custom-tailored tuxedos accepted glasses of rare vintage champagne from my impeccably dressed waitstaff. The air quickly filled with the low hum of sophisticated networking, clinking crystal, and the heavy scent of expensive perfumes mixed with thousands of fresh white orchids. It was an incredible turnout. Preston had cast a massive and very convincing net to catch these wealthy fish. They all believed they were here to buy into the most exclusive private equity fund of the decade. None of them realized they were standing inside a $50 million mousetrap designed perfectly by the woman hiding on the balcony above them. Then I saw them. My parents made their grand entrance, sweeping into the room with the obnoxious confidence of royalty, inspecting their kingdom. My mother Brenda had swapped her daytime lavender suit for an incredibly gaudy, heavily sequined gold evening gown that practically blinded anyone who looked directly at her. My father, Pastor Calvin, was wearing a crisp white tuxedo jacket with a black bow tie, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water like it was a sacred chalice. They immediately gravitated toward the most powerful people in the room. I adjusted my hidden earpiece, tapping the side of it to isolate the audio feed from the lobby microphones. Their voices came through sharp and clear right into my ear. "Oh yes, the property is simply magnificent," my mother boasted loudly, waving her manicured hand toward the vaulted glass ceilings. "Our son-in-law Preston has such a brilliant eye for real estate. He is finalizing the acquisition of this entire resort tonight. He simply insists on giving his family the very best." My father nodded solemnly, patting the shoulder of a prominent local politician. "The Lord has truly blessed us with Preston," he added in his deep pastoral boom. "He comes from such a distinguished wealthy lineage in Charleston. He is a billionaire, you know, but so remarkably humble. He even hired our youngest daughter to help manage the front desk, just to teach her the value of hard work." I let out a quiet, dark laugh that echoed softly in the empty mezzanine. They were parading my success around and giving all the credit to a man who was literally hours away from going to federal prison. A few yards away from my parents, I spotted Dominique and Preston. Dominique was practically glowing with toxic pride. She was wearing a blindingly white designer maternity dress that clung tightly to her figure, and there, resting perfectly against her collarbone, was my $1.5 million sapphire and diamond Cartier necklace. She was touching it constantly, making sure every wealthy woman in her vicinity noticed the massive blue stone. Preston, on the other hand, looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His tuxedo fit perfectly, but his posture was stiff and defensive. He was holding a glass of scotch with a white-knuckled grip. I could see the faint red mark on his cheek where my security guard had slammed him into the wall earlier. He was forcing a charming smile as he spoke with Richard Sterling and the other major investors, but his eyes kept darting nervously toward the main doors and the waitstaff. He was terrified. He knew he was running out of time to secure their funds before the banks completely froze him out. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the second-floor balcony, completely mesmerized by the pathetic, tragic play unfolding beneath me. This was the exact family dynamic that had suffocated me for 30 years. The golden child draped in stolen jewels, the abusive fraudster husband pretending to be a savior, the narcissistic parents blindly worshipping white wealth while actively tearing down their own black daughter to make themselves look superior. But tonight the script was finally mine. I was no longer the scapegoat shrinking away from their cruel insults. I was the silent predator watching my prey strut blindly across the ballroom floor. I knew every single exit I owned, every single camera, and I held every single string. Elijah walked up silently beside me on the balcony, slipping his hand gently around my waist. He looked down at the crowd, and then looked at me. "Richard just authorized the wire transfer," he whispered softly. "The $10 million is sitting in the escrow account. Holding pattern. Preston is going to make his speech in 10 minutes to close the deal." I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile, and leaned my forearms against the cool marble railing. "Let him speak," I murmured. My eyes locked completely on my sister and her husband. Let him climb all the way to the very top of his little mountain, so the whole city can watch him completely fall. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I stepped away from the cold marble railing and began my slow descent down the grand sweeping glass staircase that connected the mezzanine to the main ballroom floor. Every single step I took was deliberate and measured. The heavy emerald silk of my custom haute couture gown trailed beautifully behind me, catching the brilliant light of the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. The dress was an absolute masterpiece of modern design, featuring an elegant neckline and a sleek silhouette that commanded absolute authority. It was not a dress you wore to blend into the background. It was a dress you wore when you owned the entire room, literally and figuratively. As I reached the halfway point of the staircase, a few of the wealthy guests standing near the bottom began to notice my presence. Their quiet conversations slowly faded out as heads naturally turned in my direction. The rich venture capitalists and influential local politicians paused their networking to stare. A clear path naturally began to form at the base of the stairs as if the crowd instinctively recognized that a person of extreme importance was arriving. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders back, my chin held high, and my expression entirely unbothered. My mother Brenda was in the middle of laughing loudly at a terrible joke made by a city council member when she finally noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy. She turned her head slightly to see what everyone was looking at, and her eyes landed directly on me. The arrogant smile on her face completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She stared intensely at my emerald gown and then up at my face, her deeply prejudiced brain struggling to process why the daughter she treated like a lowly invisible maid was descending the main staircase looking like a young billionaire. She aggressively nudged my father, Pastor Calvin, who actually gasped and nearly dropped his crystal glass of sparkling water. When he finally saw me, my mother was instantly furious. She actually believed that I had broken into a wealthy guest's private room, stolen an expensive designer evening gown, and decided to crash Preston's elite charity gala just to embarrass the family. She thought I was a rogue, ungrateful employee stepping wildly out of line to ruin her perfect high society night. The deep-seated jealousy and bitter lifelong resentment she harbored toward me flared up instantly in her dark eyes. She could not stand the absolute fact that I was effortlessly outshining her and her precious golden child Dominique right in front of the Atlanta elite. She decided right then and there to put me back in my miserable place. My mother aggressively snatched a full heavy glass of dark vintage red wine right off the silver tray of a passing terrified waiter. The deep burgundy liquid sloshed violently against the crystal rim as she gripped the fragile stem tightly, her knuckles turning white. She began marching directly toward the bottom of the staircase, her heavy, gaudy sequined gold dress rustling loudly with every angry, determined step. Dominique and Preston were standing just a few feet away from the landing, completely unaware of the massive approaching storm. My mother kept her eyes locked entirely on me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure spite and hatred. She was obviously going to pretend to accidentally trip and casually throw the entire glass of red wine right down the front of my beautiful silk gown. She wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of the massive crowd, force me to run crying into the catering kitchen to clean myself up, and ensure that I remained the pathetic broken scapegoat of the family. I finally reached the bottom step and stepped gracefully onto the polished hardwood floor. My mother violently accelerated her pace, aiming directly for my chest. I did not panic. I did not flinch. I did not even brace myself for impact. I simply watched her clumsy, entirely predictable movements with the cool, calm precision of an apex predator as she closed the final few feet of distance. Between us, she raised the heavy crystal glass slightly, her wrist violently flicking forward to launch the dark red liquid right at my dress, in one fluid, seamless, and effortless motion. I simply took a half step to my left and gracefully pivoted my body away from her trajectory. My mother had committed entirely too much forward momentum to her fake theatrical stumble. She could not stop herself or change her direction. The heavy, splashing wave of dark burgundy wine flew entirely past me, missing my emerald gown by mere fractions of an inch. It sailed straight through the empty air and landed directly onto the chest of the person standing immediately behind me. Dominique. The dark red wine hit Dominique's pristine white designer maternity dress with a sickening wet slap. The liquid violently splashed across her pale collarbone, staining the sapphire necklace before soaking completely into the expensive fabric, ruining it. Instantly, Dominique let out a sudden blood-curdling scream of absolute shock, looking down at her ruined outfit in total panicked disbelief. My mother loudly gasped, dropping the empty crystal glass onto the hardwood floor, where it shattered into dozens of tiny pieces. "Oh my God! Dominique!" my mother shrieked, throwing her hands over her mouth in sheer panic. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing right in the middle of a beautiful note. The entire grand ballroom went completely dead silent. Every wealthy investor, prominent politician, and elite socialite turned to stare at the hysterical, shrieking woman and her dripping, wine-soaked daughter. I stood perfectly still right beside them, my emerald gown untouched, offering my mother a very slow, very cold, and incredibly satisfied smile. She had desperately tried to drown me, but she only ended up destroying her own golden child in front of the entire world. The whispering began instantly among the wealthy guests, spreading like wildfire across the elegant room. Pointing fingers and muffled gasps filled the uncomfortable silence. I smoothed out a tiny invisible wrinkle on my silk skirt, thoroughly enjoying every second of their complete public humiliation. The uncomfortable silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sharp, loud feedback screech from the main audio system. At the front of the grand ballroom, Preston had practically sprinted away from his sobbing, wine-soaked wife and embarrassed mother-in-law, realizing that the entire evening and his only chance to secure the $10 million was rapidly slipping through his desperate fingers. He climbed the short set of carpeted stairs to the elevated mahogany stage, his face flushed and his breathing heavy. He stood behind the clear acrylic podium and forcefully tapped the silver microphone to demand the attention of the distracted crowd. The sharp tapping echoed through the massive room, forcing the wealthy investors and local politicians to pull their eyes away from the humiliating spectacle of Dominique and my mother and redirect their focus to the stage. Preston gripped the edges of the podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white under the bright stage lights. He forced a wide, charismatic smile onto his face, attempting to project the absolute confidence of a billionaire titan of industry. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Preston began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, projecting a fake aristocratic charm. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the massive success and the incredibly bright future of the Hayes Private Equity Fund." He paused for a moment, letting his eyes sweep across the room, making direct eye contact with Richard Sterling and the other heavy-hitting venture capitalists sitting at the front tables. "Please excuse the minor distraction in the back," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, pointing toward his own ruined wife and terrified mother-in-law. Passion and excitement sometimes get the better of our more emotional guests. But we are here tonight to discuss legacy. We are here to discuss generational wealth and unparalleled opportunity. I stood perfectly still near the back of the room, the emerald silk of my custom gown shimmering faintly in the ambient light. I watched as my father, Pastor Calvin, completely abandoned his crying daughter and rushed to the front row, dragging my humiliated mother along with him. They wanted to be as close to the stage as possible to bask in the stolen glory of their fraudulent son-in-law. My father looked up at Preston with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship, his hands clasped together as if he were looking at an actual divine savior. My mother was wiping her own tears of frustration away and replacing them with tears of fake joyous pride, completely ignoring the fact that Dominique was still standing in the middle of the room covered in sticky red wine. Preston puffed out his chest, his ego inflating to massive proportions as he saw the wealthy crowd actually listening to his pathetic lies when I started this fun. I wanted to focus on acquiring properties that reflect true prestige. Preston continued, leaning casually against the acrylic podium. He gestured grandly toward the soaring glass ceilings and the massive crystal chandeliers above us. I look for properties that have an undeniable aura of power and sophistication, and that is exactly why I invited you all to this specific location tonight. For months, my team has been locked in intense private negotiations with the current owners of this magnificent property. They were struggling to maintain the standard of excellence that this architecture demands, and they came to me begging for a buyout. A low murmur of impressed approval rippled through the crowd of elite investors. Men in expensive tailored suits nodded thoughtfully, and women in dripping diamonds whispered to one another in hushed, excited tones. Preston was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly how to play to their greedy desires. He paused dramatically, letting the heavy silence build the anticipation before delivering his final massive lie. It is my absolute honor to officially announce tonight that the Hayes Private Equity Fund is in the final legal stages of fully acquiring the Onyx Resort. Preston declared, his voice rising to a triumphant shout. We are taking complete ownership of this entire $50 million estate by tomorrow morning. The paperwork will be signed, and this property will become the crown jewel of our investment portfolio. Those of you who have wired your investments tonight are no longer just partners. You are now the partial owners of the most profitable and exclusive luxury resort in the entire Southeast. The grand ballroom absolutely erupted. The crowd of wealthy investors broke into massive roaring applause. Richard Sterling stood up from his front row seat and began clapping loudly, a wide, satisfied smile on his face. The local politicians joined the standing ovation, completely, entirely fooled by the sheer arrogance and conviction of Preston's performance. The string quartet began playing a triumphant classical piece to accompany the celebration. Preston stood on the stage, soaking in the thunderous applause. Like a parched man standing in the rain, he raised his hands in a gesture of humble victory. A smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He actually believed he had pulled it off. He believed he had successfully stolen my empire and saved his own pathetic life. Down in the front row, my parents were completely losing their minds. Pastor Calvin was openly weeping, tears of joy streaming down his face as he clapped his hands together. He was shouting loud praises to the ceiling, thanking God for blessing his family with such incredible elite status. My mother Brenda was sobbing hysterically, clutching her gaudy gold dress, holding onto my father's arm, as if she might faint from the sheer overwhelming pride of being associated with a billionaire hotel owner. They were entirely, completely consumed by the absolute peak of their lifelong delusion. They thought they had finally reached the absolute pinnacle of high society. I watched the entire sickening spectacle from the back of the room, my face perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any emotion. The applause was deafening, the fake smiles were blinding, and the sheer volume of the lies was staggering. Preston was flying higher than he had ever flown in his entire miserable life. He was sitting on top of the world, surrounded by the wealth and admiration he had craved since the day he was born. His ego was completely unchecked, his arrogance was boundless, and his trap was perfectly, entirely set. He had just publicly claimed ownership of my property in front of the most powerful people in the state, committing federal fraud on a microphone while being recorded from 3 different high-definition camera angles. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the sweet air of absolute victory. The balloon had been inflated to its absolute maximum capacity, and it was finally time for me to bring out the needle. I gave Elijah a single subtle nod from across the room, and he immediately pressed a button on his encrypted tablet. Preston raised his arms wide, preparing to ask the wealthy crowd to raise their glasses for a final celebratory toast. But the words never left his mouth. The power to his microphone was instantly severed. The booming state-of-the-art sound system went completely dead, cutting off his triumphant voice in mid-sentence. The sudden heavy silence in the massive grand ballroom was incredibly jarring. Preston tapped the silver mesh of the microphone with his index finger, assuming it was just a simple technical glitch. He cleared his throat and tried to speak a little louder, but without the heavy amplification, his natural voice sounded incredibly weak and pathetic, struggling to reach even the second row of the audience. He looked off into the wings, waving his hand frantically at the audio technicians, demanding they fix the issue immediately. But my technicians had abandoned their posts and locked the control room doors exactly as I instructed. The wealthy investors lowered their champagne glasses, looking around the room in mild confusion. My father, Pastor Calvin, frowned slightly, leaning forward in his front row seat. My mother, Brenda, stopped her dramatic weeping and wiped her eyes, wondering why the spectacular show had suddenly paused. Preston gripped the acrylic podium, his knuckles turning white again, as genuine panic finally began to replace his towering arrogance. He had absolutely no idea how to handle a room full of billionaires without a script and a working microphone. Then the main crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted glass ceiling suddenly dimmed. The warm golden light faded away, plunging the elegant ballroom into a cool, dramatic darkness. The crowd let out a collective murmur of surprise. Preston looked up at the ceiling, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. Before he could attempt to calm the restless crowd, the massive LED screen covering the entire back wall of the stage suddenly flickered to life. It cast a harsh, bright blue glow directly over Preston's shoulders. Previously, the screen had been displaying the sleek, sophisticated logo of the Hayes Private Equity Fund. But now the logo was completely gone. In its place was a crystal-clear, high-definition scan of a federal legal document. The bold black letters at the top of the screen were massive, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. It was the official bank foreclosure notice for Preston's $3 million luxury estate in Buckhead. The document clearly listed his name, his zero balance, and the immediate eviction mandate. Richard Sterling, the respected venture capitalist, sitting in the front row, squinted his eyes to read the glowing text. He slowly stood up from his chair, the satisfied smile completely vanishing from his face. Preston noticed the sudden shift in Richard's expression. He slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at the massive screen behind him. When he saw the foreclosure notice, his entire body went completely rigid. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. The slide on the massive screen automatically transitioned. The next image displayed a series of bounced checks written from the Hayes Private Equity Fund business account. Each check was stamped with bright red letters reading "insufficient funds." Then came the screenshots of his frozen offshore accounts, followed by the official Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing stamped by a federal judge. The undeniable absolute proof of his catastrophic financial ruin was being broadcasted to the most powerful people in Atlanta. The polite confusion in the ballroom instantly mutated into a rising tide of angry, shocked whispers. Men in tailored tuxedos began pointing at the stage, exchanging furious looks. Women covered in expensive diamonds gasped and stepped back away from the podium as if Preston had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Richard Sterling slammed his crystal glass down onto the table, shattering the delicate stem. He realized instantly the $10 million he wired into escrow was part of a desperate scam. Preston scrambled behind the acrylic podium, frantically slapping his hands against the podium surface, looking for a keyboard or a switch to turn the screen off. "Turn it off!" he screamed loudly, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "Somebody please turn that screen off right now!" But there was no switch, and nobody came to his rescue. He was trapped on the brightly lit stage, forced to stand in front of the irrefutable evidence of his pathetic criminal lies. The final slide clicked onto the massive LED screen, and it was the ultimate death blow. It was the audio transcript from the lobby earlier that afternoon, accompanied by still frames from the security footage. The text clearly showed Preston admitting to Richard Sterling that he was acquiring the Onyx Resort today, followed by the legal deed proving that the Hayes Private Equity Fund had zero legal claim to the property. The words, wire fraud and securities fraud, flashed across the screen in bold red letters. The grand ballroom completely descended into absolute chaos. Angry billionaires began shouting, demanding their security details, and calling their bank managers to freeze their wire transfers. My parents, Pastor Calvin and Brenda, stood frozen in the front row. Their eyes darted back and forth across the screen, reading the devastating truth. The illusion of their billionaire son-in-law crumbled into dust right before their eyes. My mother let out a horrific wailing sound, suddenly clutching her chest tightly, as if she was physically shot. My father dropped his glass of water and collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his trembling hands. Somewhere in the middle of the chaotic crowd, Dominique let out a shrill, piercing scream of pure agony. Her perfect elite lifestyle, her mansion and her fake identity had just been vaporized in front of the entire city. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The shrieks of my sister and the panicked shouts of the wealthy investors echoed through the darkened grand ballroom, blending into a symphony of absolute destruction. It was time to step out of the shadows and claim the stage. I placed my hand gently on Elijah's arm, and together we began to walk down the center aisle of the room. The crowd was in a state of complete frenzy. But as we moved forward, something incredible happened. The angry billionaires and the terrified socialites instinctively parted, giving us a wide, clear path. My emerald silk gown glided silently over the polished hardwood floor, catching the harsh blue light, radiating from the massive LED screen, displaying Preston's criminal ruin. I kept my head held high, my posture unyielding, and my expression completely calm. Elijah walked right beside me, his presence solid and protective, wearing his tailored navy blue suit, like a suit of armor as we approached the front row. My parents finally noticed us. Pastor Calvin was still slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, but he looked up through his trembling fingers when he saw the hem of my emerald dress approach. My mother, Brenda, was gasping for air, clutching her chest, but her tear-filled eyes widened in sheer confusion as she watched me bypass their table completely and walk directly toward the short set of carpeted stairs leading up to the elevated mahogany stage. Preston was still cowering behind the clear acrylic podium, sweating profusely and frantically, pressing random buttons, hoping to somehow erase the massive federal bankruptcy filings glowing brightly behind him. He looked up and saw me climbing the stairs. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to demand that I get off his stage, but the absolute terror gripping his throat rendered him entirely mute. Elijah stepped up onto the stage right behind me. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black wireless microphone. It was connected to an entirely separate encrypted audio network that my security team had set up specifically for this exact moment. Elijah handed the microphone to me with a reassuring nod. I wrapped my fingers around the smooth metal handle, took a slow, deep breath, and turned to face the chaotic sea of wealthy investors, local politicians, and my entirely broken family. I raised the microphone to my lips and spoke. "Good evening, everyone." I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear and incredibly powerful. Through the massive speakers bouncing off the vaulted glass ceilings, the sheer authority in my voice instantly cut through the panic and the shouting. The angry venture capitalists stopped yelling into their cell phones. The terrified women stopped whispering, and my family completely froze. The entire grand ballroom descended into a sudden heavy silence, all eyes locking directly onto me as I stood gracefully in front of the glowing evidence of Preston's fraud. For those of you who do not know me, My name is Camille, I announced, taking a slow, deliberate step away from Preston and moving to the absolute center of the stage. I am not the front desk manager, I am not the concierge, and I am certainly not an assistant wearing a borrowed uniform, as some people in this room were led to believe. I gestured gracefully toward the soaring architecture of the room, the imported marble columns, and the crystal chandeliers. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole legal owner of the Onyx Resort. The collective gasp that rippled through the grand ballroom was loud enough to be felt in the floorboards. Richard Sterling, the highly respected venture capitalist who had almost lost $10 million to Preston's scam, slowly lowered his cell phone and stared at me in absolute awe. A look of deep, profound respect washing over his face. The other wealthy investors began murmuring among themselves, realizing that the young black woman standing before them in the breathtaking emerald gown was the actual billionaire titan of industry they had been desperate to meet. They realized that I had just saved them from committing to the most devastating financial mistake of their lives. I turned my attention down to the front row, looking directly into the eyes of the people who had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was worthless. My mother Brenda was staring up at me, her jaw completely unhinged, her face an ashen gray. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, her mind violently snapping as she tried to reconcile the image of her scapegoat daughter with the reality of the multi-million-dollar empire surrounding her. My father, Pastor Calvin, gripped the edge of the table so hard his fingers turned blue, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the devastating truth finally crushed his fragile, arrogant ego. He realized in that exact moment that the daughter he had threatened to excommunicate just a few hours ago over a diamond necklace was actually the sole owner of the entire property, and the very necklace she had been wearing. Dominique was standing completely paralyzed in the middle of the room, the sticky red wine drying on her ruined white designer dress. Her tear-streaked face was a picture of absolute, utter devastation. She looked from Preston, who was currently weeping silently behind the acrylic podium, up to me standing powerfully in the center of the stage. She finally realized that I had never been jealous of her. I had never wanted her life. I had simply left her behind in her fake, miserable existence, while I built a real kingdom from the ground up. I turned my gaze back to the crowd, sweeping my eyes over the terrified face of my fraudulent brother-in-law and the shocked faces of the Atlanta elite. I allowed Preston Hayes to invite you all here tonight to use my property because I knew he was planning to commit federal wire fraud, I explained, my voice steady and completely unyielding. I knew he was entirely bankrupt, and I wanted to ensure that his criminal activities were brought to light before any of you transferred your hard-earned capital into his offshore accounts. The foreclosure notices and the bankruptcy filings you see on the screen behind me are absolutely real. They were certified by a federal judge this morning. There is no acquisition happening tonight. There is no private equity fund. Preston Hayes is nothing more than a desperate criminal who tried to use my name and my resort to steal from you. The room remained dead silent, hanging on to every single word I spoke. The sheer magnitude of my revelation settled heavily over the grand ballroom, completely suffocating the fake elite aesthetic my family had spent decades trying to build. I stood there under the bright stage lights, feeling the incredible weight of 30 years of emotional abuse finally lift off my shoulders. I had not just exposed a criminal, I had completely reclaimed my entire life, and I had done it with absolute undeniable grace. I looked down at Preston one last time, watching him shiver under the intense glare of the blue light. He had nothing left to say, and nowhere left to run. His entire identity had been stripped away, leaving only a pathetic shell of a man. I lowered the microphone slowly, letting the profound reality of my words sink into the minds of everyone present. The truth was finally out in the open, and my absolute victory was now permanently etched into the history of this property. I turned to my side and gently passed the sleek black microphone to Elijah, who had been standing solidly beside me, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute calculated precision. He took the microphone, his grip firm, and stepped forward slightly, placing himself directly between me and the pathetic man cowering behind the acrylic podium. Elijah looked out over the sea of shocked faces, his expression transforming instantly from the supportive, loving partner into the ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney that made him an absolute legend in the legal world of Atlanta. His dark eyes swept across the room, locking specifically onto the wealthy investors sitting in the front rows. "Good evening again, everyone." Elijah began, his voice smooth, deep, and completely commanding, echoing through the grand ballroom with an undeniable professional authority. "My name is Elijah Crawford, and I am the lead legal counsel for the Onyx Resort Empire and the personal attorney to the Chief Executive Officer, Camille. As my client just brilliantly explained to you, the man standing on this stage has absolutely no legal or financial ties to this property whatsoever. Preston Hayes has spent the last 6 months aggressively orchestrating an elaborate, highly illegal scheme to defraud every single investor sitting in this room tonight." Elijah paced slowly across the front of the stage, his polished shoes silent against the dark wood. He pointed a steady accusatory finger directly at Preston, who was now visibly shaking his tailored tuxedo. Looking suddenly too large for his shrinking, cowardly frame, Mr. Hayes knew his private equity fund was completely bankrupt. Elijah continued, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor-sharp knife. He knew his offshore accounts were permanently frozen, and he knew his personal luxury estate was being actively foreclosed upon by the federal bank. His solution to this massive financial ruin was to use his familial connection to my client to manipulate his way into this luxury resort. He intended to use the sheer opulence of this property as a fake visual guarantee to trick you all into transferring millions of dollars into his personal escrow accounts before fleeing the country to avoid federal prosecution. A loud collective gasp swept through the wealthy crowd. Richard Sterling, the massive venture capitalist from New York, closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief, rubbing his temples as he realized just how close he had come to losing $10 million to a desperate con artist. The other billionaires in the room began nodding slowly, their initial anger morphing into a deep, terrifying realization of the massive bullet they had just dodged thanks to my silent, calculated trap. The crime Preston Hayes attempted to commit here tonight is not just a simple misunderstanding or a bad business deal. Elijah announced, his voice rising in volume and intensity. It is a textbook case of federal wire fraud and massive securities fraud. He actively solicited high-net-worth individuals under entirely false pretenses, using a property he does not own as fraudulent collateral. But unfortunately for Mr. Hayes, my legal team and the federal government have been monitoring his every single move. We have completely secured all of his financial records, his forged banking documents, and the security footage from this afternoon, where he openly admitted his fraudulent intentions directly on camera. Preston let out a pathetic whimpering sound, backing away from the clear acrylic podium until his back hit the massive glowing lead screen displaying his bankruptcy filings. He looked completely trapped, like a cornered, terrified animal, desperately searching the dark edges of the grand ballroom for an escape route that simply did not exist. His breathing was shallow and erratic, his perfectly styled hair now a messy, disheveled disaster plastered to his sweaty forehead. He looked down at my parents, Pastor Calvin and Brenda, silently pleading with his eyes for them to somehow save him. But my parents were completely paralyzed, glued to their seats in absolute silent horror, watching their fake billionaire idol completely disintegrate, right before their eyes. Elijah stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the stage. He slowly lowered the microphone and looked directly toward the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the grand ballroom. He gave a single sharp nod. The timing was absolutely impeccable. The massive double doors of the ballroom violently burst open, hitting the walls with a loud, booming thud that echoed like a cannon shot through the silent room. The wealthy guests in the back rows physically jumped out of their seats as a team of 12 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents marched directly into the room. They were dressed in dark tactical suits, their federal badges gleaming brightly under the massive crystal chandeliers. Their heavy boots stomped rhythmically against the pristine hardwood floor, cutting a straight, completely undeniable path straight down the center aisle of the crowd. The guests scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the tables to let the federal agents pass. Preston let out a high-pitched scream of pure terror. When he saw the agents marching toward the stage, he scrambled to his left, trying to run toward the heavy velvet curtains masking the backstage exit. But his legs were shaking so violently that he tripped over the microphone cord and collapsed heavily onto the wooden stage floor. Two of the largest federal agents sprinted up the carpeted stairs and instantly descended upon him. They grabbed Preston by the shoulders of his expensive custom tuxedo and yanked him roughly to his feet, spinning him around to face the massive LED screen. "Preston Hayes, you are under federal arrest for wire fraud securities, fraud and attempted grand larceny." The lead agent barked, his voice loud enough to be heard clearly, without a microphone. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, locking securely around Preston's wrists, echoed loudly across the silent stage. The sound was incredibly final. It was the undeniable sound of his completely fabricated empire crumbling into absolute dust. The lead agent roughly patted him down, while Preston sobbed uncontrollably. Tears and sweat streaming down his flushed face, completely ruining his expensive cologne and his carefully crafted old money image. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire from Charleston who looked down on people he deemed beneath him. He was just a pathetic, broken criminal, wearing steel bracelets, crying on the floor of a resort. He tried to steal. The federal agents began marching him aggressively toward the front of the stage to lead him down the stairs. Preston was stumbling, his head hanging low in absolute ultimate disgrace as they paraded him right past the front row. My mother Brenda turned her head away, unable to look at the humiliating reality of the man she had proudly worshipped. My father, Pastor Calvin, stared blankly at the floor, his entire worldview completely shattered. Dominique stood alone in the crowd, her wine-soaked dress sticking to her skin, watching the father of her child being dragged away by federal authorities to spend the next decade in a federal prison cell. The arrogant old money facade was entirely destroyed, swept away by the brutal, undeniable force of the truth. I stood quietly beside Elijah, watching the entire magnificent downfall with a heart full of absolute perfect peace. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the sound of Preston's pathetic sobbing and leaving the grand ballroom in a state of stunning suspended animation. The wealthy investors and local politicians were entirely speechless, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the federal sting they had just witnessed. But the silence was violently shattered by a sudden blood-curdling scream. It was Dominique. She was standing in the exact same spot where the red wine had ruined her white designer maternity dress. But now she was clutching the sides of her head, her mouth wide open in a scream of absolute hysterical agony. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her carefully styled hair, ruining the flawless aesthetic she had spent hours preparing. She screamed until her voice went completely hoarse, and then she began to aggressively push her way through the crowd of shocked billionaires. Stumbling blindly toward the front of the stage, she stopped, right at the base of the carpeted stairs, looking up at me with wild, tear-streaked eyes. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streams, mixing with the dark burgundy wine stains on her chest. "You ruined my life!" Dominique shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. "You did this on purpose, Camille. You set us up to be humiliated in front of the entire city. My husband is going to prison, and my baby is going to grow up without a father. How could you be so incredibly evil and vindictive? You are a monster." I looked down at my older sister, the golden child who had spent my entire existence stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She expected me to feel guilty, She expected the old Camille to apologize and try to fix the massive mess her husband had created. I slowly walked down the short flight of stairs, my emerald silk gown gliding effortlessly over the steps, until I was standing directly in front of her, on the main ballroom floor. Elijah followed closely behind me, a silent, intimidating presence, ensuring that Dominique would not try anything physical. I stopped just inches away from her, looking directly into her frantic, desperate eyes. My expression was entirely, completely devoid of any sympathy or regret. I did not force Preston to commit federal wire fraud. Dominique, I said, my voice low, cold and steady enough to freeze boiling water. I did not force him to bankrupt his fund or lie to federal investigators. And I certainly did not force him to bring his massive criminal enterprise into my luxury resort, looking for a quick payout to save his miserable skin. He destroyed his own life, and he took you down with him because you were too busy basking in his fake old money glow to realize you were married to a desperate broke con artist. Dominique let out a loud, dramatic sob, throwing her hands up into the air, trying to play the ultimate victim card. "But I am your sister," she wailed, looking around the room to see if any of the wealthy guests were taking pity on her, but the investors only stared at her with deep, profound disgust. "I am pregnant, and I have absolutely nothing left. You have to help me, Camille. You have to tell the federal agents. It was a misunderstanding. You have all this money now. You can pay off his debts and save our family." She was still completely delusional, still entirely convinced that her status as the golden child meant she was immune to consequences and entitled to my hard-earned wealth. I let out a slow, humorless laugh that made Dominique flinch. "You do not have a family anymore," I reminded her, leaning slightly closer to her tear-stained face. "And you are right. You have absolutely nothing left. Your $3 million estate in Buckhead is padlocked. Your luxury cars are repossessed, and your husband is facing a decade behind steel bars. You are broke, Dominique, completely and utterly bankrupt. But before you figure out where you are going to sleep tonight, there is one piece of business we need to conclude right now." I raised my hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at the massive blue sapphire and diamond Cartier necklace resting against her wine-stained collarbone. "Take it off," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. Dominique gasped, her hand flying up to clutch the priceless jewels, as if I had just asked her to remove her own heart. "What?" she stammered. Taking a clumsy step backward, Daddy said, "I could wear this. It is mine for the weekend. You cannot just take it back from me now. When my entire life is falling apart, have some basic human compassion. Camille, you cannot do this to me in front of all these important people." I took a step forward, backing her directly into the edge of a catering table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle. "That necklace is worth $1.5 million, I stated loudly, making sure the surrounding investors and my horrified parents in the front row heard the exact astronomical figure. "It was purchased at a private auction in Geneva, and it belongs, entirely to me. You snuck into my private suite and stole it off my vanity, thinking you were entitled to my property, just like you always have been. You have exactly 5 seconds to unhook that clasp and hand it to me, or I will walk right out those mahogany doors. Flag down the federal agents who are currently shoving your fraudulent husband into a black SUV, and officially add grand larceny to the police report." The threat hit her like a physical blow, the sheer reality of the situation finally piercing through her thick layers of lifelong entitlement. She looked at my face and saw absolutely no hesitation. She knew I was not bluffing. She knew I would send her to a federal holding cell right alongside Preston, without shedding a single tear. Her hands began to shake violently as she reached behind her neck, fumbling desperately with the intricate platinum clasp. It took her 3 panicked tries before the heavy diamond necklace finally dropped into her trembling palms. She held it out to me, her head bowed in ultimate soul-crushing defeat. I snatched the necklace from her hands and passed it to Elijah, who carefully secured the priceless piece of jewelry inside his tailored suit jacket. The moment the diamonds left her hands, Dominique physically broke the last remaining symbol of her fake elite status, was gone, and the sheer crushing weight of her new reality completely collapsed on top of her. She realized in that exact moment that she would be walking out of this luxury resort with absolutely nothing to her name. Her entire identity was built on the foundation of being better than me. And now I owned the building. She was crying inside. Her knees buckled, and she dropped heavily onto the polished hardwood floor. Right at my feet, she curled her arms around her knees and began to weep hysterically. The ugly guttural sobs of a woman who had just realized she was entirely, completely alone in the world. She was husbandless, she was homeless, and she was stripped of every single fake luxury she had ever used to make herself feel superior. The golden child was officially permanently shattered, lying in a puddle of spilled wine and broken dreams. I looked down at her shaking form, feeling absolutely nothing but the cool, satisfying breeze of total closure. I turned away from my sobbing sister and looked back toward the front row of tables where my parents were still standing. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, Brenda, had finally broken out of their stunned paralysis. They realized that Dominique was not the only one whose life had just been completely destroyed by the devastating truth. Their entire social standing, their prestigious reputation in the community, and their pristine image as the perfect elite family were rapidly dissolving right before their very eyes. They scrambled out from behind their table and began to rush toward the edge of the stage, moving with a frantic, desperate energy that completely contradicted their usual arrogant grace. My mother was practically tripping over the heavy sequined fabric of her gaudy gold dress, while my father pushed his way past the shocked investors, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. They stopped right at the bottom of the carpeted stairs, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Camille, please," my father begged, his deep pastoral voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "You have made your point. You have exposed Preston, and you have claimed your resort. But you have to stop this right now before the press gets hold of the story. We need to handle this privately. We need to handle this as a family." My mother nodded frantically, reaching her shaking hand out toward the hem of my emerald silk gown. "Baby, please," she pleaded, using a sweet, affectionate nickname she had not spoken since I was a little girl. "You are embarrassing us in front of the most important people in Atlanta. We are your parents. We raised you. We sacrificed everything for you. You cannot just destroy our reputation like this. Put the microphone down and let us go to my suite so we can discuss this quietly, like civilized adults. We can forgive you for this public outburst if you just help us fix the damage." I stared down at them, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. They were not sorry for the horrific way they had treated me. They were only sorry that their fake billionaire son-in-law had been exposed as a criminal, and they were terrified of losing their precious social status. They wanted to retreat into the shadows, sweep their massive failures under the rug, and pretend that they were still the elite rulers of their community. They wanted to use the word family as a weapon to silence me, just like they always had. I did not put the microphone down. Instead, I raised it back up to my lips, locking my eyes directly onto my father's sweating, panicked face. "There is no more family," I announced, my voice ringing out clearly through the grand ballroom, cutting through their pathetic, desperate pleas. "And there is certainly no more hiding behind closed doors. You two spent 30 years prioritizing a fake aesthetic over your own daughter. You worshipped a white fraudster simply because he came from old money, and you allowed him to treat me like garbage because you thought he was your golden ticket to the absolute top of high society. You do not get to demand my silence now." My father took a step back, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. "Camille, do not do this," he hissed, his pastoral authority completely shattering. He knew exactly what I was about to say. He knew I had access to every single piece of financial data that Preston had left lying around my resort. and he knew his deepest, darkest secret was about to be dragged into the blinding stage light. I shifted my gaze away from my parents and looked directly at the round table, situated at the absolute center of the front row. Sitting at that table were 7 older men and women dressed in conservative formal attire. They were the senior executive board of elders for my father's massive megachurch, the very people who controlled the church finances and had the power to strip him of his pastoral title. They had been invited tonight specifically, so my father could brag about his wealthy connections. I addressed them directly, my voice steady and completely unyielding to the esteemed board of elders sitting in the front row. I said, watching as they all sat up straighter, their expressions tense and deeply concerned. I think you should know exactly how far your beloved Pastor Calvin was willing to go to protect his fake billionaire son-in-law. Preston Hayes approached my father 3 days ago and confessed that his private equity fund was completely bankrupt. Preston needed a massive influx of cash to satisfy his angry creditors and avoid federal prison. My father let out a loud, tortured groan, burying his face in his hands. My mother let out another shrill shriek, clutching my father's arm. But I completely ignored them and kept speaking directly to the horrified church elders. Instead of turning Preston into the authorities, my father agreed to help him. I explained, my voice echoing loudly across the silent room. Your pastor was actively working with a corrupt bank manager to quietly mortgage the entire church pension fund. He was going to take the retirement savings of every single faithful member of your congregation and hand it over to a convicted fraudster just to save his own family from public embarrassment. He was willing to steal the life savings of thousands of innocent people just to protect the fake luxury lifestyle of his golden child. The reaction was absolutely instantaneous and completely devastating. The 7 church elders stood up from their chairs in total unison, the sheer profound disgust written clearly across their faces. The head elder, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair, pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my father. Calvin, is this true? The head elder demanded, his voice booming with righteous anger. Were you actually planning to steal from the widows and the elderly of our congregation to pay off a gambling debt for this criminal? My father could not even look the head elder in the eye. He just stared at the polished hardwood floor, tears of absolute shame streaming down his face. His silence was the only confirmation the board needed. The head elder shook his head, his face twisting with pure revulsion. You are an absolute disgrace to the pulpit, he declared loudly, making sure the entire room heard his ultimate judgment. You are officially stripped of your pastoral duties. Effective immediately. We will be launching a full forensic audit of the church accounts tomorrow morning, and if we find even 1 single cent missing, we will personally ensure that you share a federal prison cell with your son-in-law. Do not ever set foot inside our church again. The elders turned their backs on my completely broken parents and began to walk toward the exit, their departure signaling the absolute final end of my father's long, lucrative career. The wealthy investors in the room began muttering their own expressions of sheer disgust, shaking their heads at the absolute moral bankruptcy of the man who had just stood before them, preaching about legacy and blessings. My mother Brenda collapsed against the edge of the stage, sobbing hysterically, as the reality of their massive fall from grace finally crushed her. She was no longer the prestigious first lady of a powerful church. She was merely the terrified wife of a disgraced thief. My father dropped heavily to his knees right beside Dominique, his entire empire completely obliterated. They had begged me to keep their dark secrets hidden, but the blinding light of the truth had just burned their fake elite world entirely to the ground. The silence in the grand ballroom was short-lived. Once Preston was hauled away, the reality of the situation finally settled over my parents and sister. I gave another subtle nod to my director of security, who was standing by the main entrance. Immediately, a team of 6 large men in sharp dark suits stepped forward and marched toward the front row. My mother Brenda saw them coming and began to thrash wildly. her gaudy gold dress catching on the stairs. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, swatting her hands at the guards. "I am the mother of the owner. You cannot throw me out of here." My father. Pastor Calvin tried to stand up and assert his non-existent authority, attempting to puff out his chest, but his legs were giving out beneath him. "Sir, you are officially trespassing on private property." The lead security officer stated, his voice firm and lacking any sympathy. "You and your party need to vacate the premises immediately, or you will be placed under citizen's arrest." My father tried to argue, sputtering meaningless threats, but the guards simply stepped forward and grabbed him firmly by the arms, pulling him away from the table. Dominique was still sobbing hysterically on the hardwood floor, unable to walk under the crushing weight of her ruined reality. Two female security officers had to physically lift her to her feet and drag her toward the exit. She dragged her heels against the polished wood, her expensive shoes scraping loudly as she wailed for Preston. The wealthy guests watched the pathetic display in absolute silence, parting like the Red Sea to let the screaming family be escorted out of the building. Their shouts of anger echoed through the lobby until the heavy bronze front doors finally slammed shut behind them, severing their toxic presence from my life permanently. Richard Sterling, the venture capitalist, slowly walked up to the edge of the stage. He looked up at me and offered a deep, respectful bow of his head. "You saved us a tremendous amount of money and public embarrassment tonight, Camille," he said, his voice carrying a tone of absolute, genuine admiration. "If you ever decide to expand the Onyx empire, you have my direct number." The rest of the wealthy investors echoed his sentiments, raising their remaining glasses of champagne in a spontaneous toast to my success. The disastrous charity gala had suddenly transformed into the ultimate networking event, celebrating my genuine self-made empire. Elijah stood beside me, wrapping his arm around my waist and pulling me close as we watched the room come back to life with authentic, excited energy. The dark, heavy cloud that had hung over my head for 30 years had finally evaporated, leaving nothing but bright, limitless potential. 6 months passed in the blink of an eye. The federal prosecutors built an absolutely bulletproof case against Preston Hayes. He did not even try to fight the charges in court. His lawyers advised him to take a plea deal. But the evidence of his massive wire fraud and securities fraud was so incredibly overwhelming that the federal judge showed absolutely no mercy. Preston was sentenced to 10 full years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. His so-called old money family completely disowned him, refusing to pay a single cent toward his legal defense. Dominique was left entirely, utterly alone. The bank officially repossessed her massive luxury estate, her designer wardrobe and her expensive cars. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. And she did not move in alone. My parents had to move in with her. The forensic audit of my father's megachurch revealed exactly what the elders suspected. He was formally indicted for attempting to embezzle the church pension fund and completely stripped of his pastoral credentials. He avoided prison by begging for a plea deal, but he was slapped with massive fines that completely wiped out their entire life savings. My mother Brenda had to sell every piece of gaudy jewelry and designer clothing she owned just to keep the lights on in their miserable apartment. I know. All of this for an absolute unyielding fact, because my security team keeps a distant eye on them to ensure they never come near my properties. They try to call me every week using burner phones. They leave desperate voicemails begging for my forgiveness, crying about how much they miss me, and asking for small loans to buy groceries. But every single time they call, my telecom provider automatically routes their numbers to a deadline. They only hear a cold, automated voice telling them the number they are trying to reach has been permanently disconnected. They spent my entire life throwing me away, and now they have to live with the reality that they can never get me back. I am standing on the balcony of my penthouse looking out over the sparkling waters of the lake. The Onyx Resort is thriving, and my life with Elijah is filled with peace. I always thought my inability to please my parents meant I was broken. But the truth is, you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. Family is supposed to be the soil that helps you grow, but sometimes that soil is poisoned with jealousy and conditional love. Sometimes the only way to truly bloom is to take a sharp knife and sever the toxic roots tying you down. If you have ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you, please know you are not alone. Your worth is not defined by those who failed to see your value. Thank you for listening to my personal story. If this resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Remember, your best revenge is simply living a successful, happy, peaceful life without them.